À la réunion numéro 23 du Comité permanent des affaires étrangères et du développement international. Et cet après-midi, on va reprendre...
Mr. Speaker, sorry, Chair.
Okay, that's with us, and I'd be happy to start over if that was an issue for colleagues from the beginning. Do we have interpretation now? Est-ce que ça va avec l'interprétation?
Can you hear the interpretation now?
We may have a more significant issue than a temporary lapse. Colleagues, are we hearing interpretation now? Is it working?
Mr. Chair, could you say something in French, please?
Oui, bonjour.
Good afternoon, Madam Clerk. This is meeting number 23. Thank you very much. Welcome to meeting number 23 of the Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development. We will now resume debate on the motion of Mr. Harris, moved by Ms. McPherson, and the amendment was moved by Ms. Mahoda.
For instance, I believe there was agreement that we preserve the speaking order from that moment. And if that's the case, then the speaking order was Dr. Fry, Mr. Bergeron, Mr. Fonseca, and Mr. Oliphant. And with the committee's agreement, I propose that these be the first four speakers and that colleagues then use the raised hand feature or a way of signaling to the clerk if they're attending in person if they wish to intervene. And with the committee's consent to proceed in that fashion, we will now give the floor to Dr. Fry to continue the discussion. Go ahead, Dr. Fry, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. I really would like to reiterate again that there is all sorts of statements going out there saying that I have been filibustering. Filibustering is actually if I start talking about whether my cat could get a COVID vaccine or not, or if I start talking about how my next door neighbor is actually mowing her lawn. And in BC, we are mowing our lawns right now in Vancouver. But whether my next door neighbor is mowing her lawn because she didn't have a COVID vaccine and I'm concerned about that. That's the kind of stuff that filibustering is. My intervention on this debate is that I do have a huge problem with the motion as it stands. And that is because, and I'm only speaking right now as a physician, because I think that for me, and I'm hearing from a lot of constituents who call my office every day, confused about what's happening, what's going on, when are they going to get a vaccine? Are they going to get a vaccine? Is vaccine A good? Is vaccine B good? Etc. And the more that we put disinformation in a motion that is approved by this committee, the more it confuses people. And the issue here of people dying of COVID-19 is one that concerns me greatly. And for me, public health is all about testing, tracing, tracking, and surveillance. And those are the 101 of public health. And that's what I want people to do. And I also want people to have a vaccine when it becomes available to them. And I would rather that they just get clear, solid information so they can make decisions based on that, and that we don't confuse it with disinformation. And that is my major concern with this. I'm not concerned about anything else. I am concerned about the fact that, when this motion first came out, this motion was making statements that are no longer true, B, that we had all kinds of misinformation about Canada's access to to the COVAX vaccine. C, that we had all kinds of misinformation about whether people are going to get a variant, and if they get a variant, what they're supposed to do. It is confusing. And this is the kind of confusion that can cost lives and can cause the spread of this COVID-19. And we don't want the spread to continue. We want to start bringing it down. And what has further increased my concern since the last time I spoke to you was the fact that we are now seeing that in Paris, they're in lockdown from new variants of COVID-19. That is not what the spread is. People aren't even sure if that is a new spread, a new pandemic, or whether it's just the COVID-19 variants, etc. I think we're seeing Italy in lockdown, Germany in lockdown. We're seeing a third wave caused by these virulent variants. And I just think that this is scaring everyone. The anxiety is huge. As a physician, my first role is to care about the well-being of the patient, anxiety, giving them proper information. It's at the heart of what we do when we speak to things. So I am not filibustering. I am really very concerned about this. And I wanted to make sure that everybody understood what my concern was, which is at the heart of a debate. What is my concern about? Why am I worried about it? I am not filibustering. I think that people need to talk about filibusters. They're historic filibusters, and I won't go into historic filibusters where people read from the phone book. That's a filibuster. I am just concerned about misinformation that can cause people, A, not to get vaccines, B, not to know what is the right thing to do, not to know what the status of anything is. I think that I would entertain really, any kind of motion or amendment to the motion that would ensure that it is clear, that we get clarity on some of these issues, whether it be to ask ministers to come and talk to us, anything that would clarify the situation. For me, the concern for me is clarity, disinformation, the anxiety of people in Canada, patients getting depressed, people not knowing what to do. And that is what I was talking about. I am not going to continue to belabor this. I'm hoping that everybody realizes that for me, in the time of a pandemic, as a physician, a filibuster is not worth it. That's not what I'm trying to do at all. I really want to clarify. I really want to make sure people get the correct information because people are confused. They don't understand. And the first thing about anything to do with public health or medicine is informed decision-making by the patients, i.e. writ large, the public. So I think, Mr. Chair, having said that, I would be happy to find a way to entertain amendments from my colleagues that would clarify the situation, that would say what were happening, that would actually change some of the language that we had to current language right now with regard to this issue. And I'm happy to do that because for me, the idea is to get this thing done, to move forward and to make sure that patients are getting the right and people are getting the right information out there. And so without protesting that I don't think I am filibustering at all. I have not said a single thing that's off the topic. I have not said a single word that has anything to do with other than my concern about disinformation and getting clear information to people so that they can make the best decisions for us all so we can get rid of this thing. And I am also concerned by a third wave of variants hitting Europe right now and the fact that we don't know if they're variants or if they're an absolutely new type of COVID virus. So I just wanted to say that. I also wanted to say that one last piece of information that I wanted to update everybody on is that there has been a leisure poll that shows that, in fact, if you look at vaccines per 100 persons, that Canada is 7th, just behind France. And we're talking here by decimal points, not by massive amounts. So, I think, again, information, misinformation, let's just get the facts right and let people decide what they think from those facts. Thank you very much. I will cede my place, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Dr. Fry, thank you very much for your remarks. Maintenant, j'aimerais passer la parole à Monsieur Bergeron.
So I'll turn the floor over now to Mr. Bergeron. Dear colleagues, I'm very happy to finally have an opportunity to give my opinion of this motion. First of all, I've been a politician for 26 years. I was only in power for 18 months, so I am a champion of being in the opposition, therefore, and I can tell you, Mr. Chair, that I have, throughout my long political career, I have done filibustering, and I can tell you, I never talked about my cat, my dog, or the state of my lawn. When I was doing a filibuster, I would always try to be relevant so that anyone could call me to, so no one could accuse me of being off track. So with all due respect to Ms. Fry, I do recognize when there's a filibuster, regardless of what's said. And I do not want to claim that Ms. Scioto or Ms. Fry did not talk about relevant matters. But the fact remains is that this was a filibuster, and I must say that I was very surprised and even disappointed that this motion is being the subject of a filibuster. Why am I disappointed? Why I was surprised? Well, because the Liberals, my colleagues on the government side, said that they were looking for a compromise. However, when they got the mic to prevent anybody else from speaking, well, I feel that is not a way to go about seeking a compromise. So I concluded that, yes, this is a filibuster. And I repeat, I was very surprised by this and deeply disappointed because I was prepared to go for a compromise. As my other colleagues know, I'm always trying to find a compromise, and I was prepared to do so. But it took several sessions before finally I got an opportunity to speak. And I must tell you, I found it odd that one of the objectives on the government side was the idea of reporting this motion to the House, saying that we would be wasting legislative time. That was odd, even paradoxical, that the government side would waste the time of the committee saying that we mustn't waste the House's time. And it was all the more surprising that the government side has prorogued the House, and we were not able to legislate for months on end. We only began legislating this fall. So during this springtime, throughout the summer, there was not any legislation passed or studied. So this argument that bringing this motion to the House or this bringing a report before the House is depriving the House of time that it needs to legislate. It seems to me this was quite weird and paradoxical. That being said, I did have an opportunity to discuss this matter with other members on the government side, and I believe that the concern with respect to legislation is a responsibility that lies on the shoulders of all members. We have all got the responsibility of using our time wisely in legislating. I understand that full well, but I also understand that unanimous consent is possible, as we do with emergency debates. We can seat outside of regular House hours because I had an opportunity to express my opinion on this. It is true that the opposition is using these tactics more and more often, that is, transforming a simple motion into a report, which leads to a debate in the House. On the other hand, I do find that the government tries to avoid any debate in the House. And I don't think that either option is a healthy one in a democracy. I don't think it's healthy that we bring all kinds of put all kinds of matters before the House and to take up the time of the House to the detriment of legislation. But I don't think that it's healthy to avoid any debate at the House of Commons on questions that may prove to be controversial. I think that the House of Commons is the preferred place for debate on controversial issues. I had an opportunity to express this opinion to colleagues on the government side, and I had an opportunity to talk to the Minister of International Development on this matter. I discussed this issue with the minister, and that's why I was so surprised and so disappointed at the way events unfolded. As I pointed out, I had the feeling that the government side was looking for a compromise. And I must tell you, and I have said this in many fora, I don't believe that the Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development is the proper place for partisanship. For two reasons. First of all, I think that all of the colleagues in this committee share common values. And I also believe that it is always preferable to show, when we're abroad, that we are united and we speak with one voice. And this illustrates, which I just alluded to earlier, at no time since the election on October 2019, there has ever been any filibusters in this committee, with the exception of the government side on this controversial motion. So that's why I was particularly disappointed with the way events unfolded. I believe deeply, and this is not just a figure of speech, I believe that this committee should not be involved in partisan games. So I don't want to be accused of doing what I'm criticizing my colleagues of doing. So if you think this is a filibuster, I'll stop right here. But I think that we need to move a sub-amendment to Mrs. Sahoda's motion. I would replace global circumstances by the words various factors. As I already pointed out, Mr. Chair, I believe that there are circumstances, factors, which are beyond the control of the government, and I also said that there are also factors that flow from poor decisions made by the government. So by putting in a variety of factors, everybody can interpret the way they want. Are these circumstances or factors that are beyond the control of the government, or is it arising from the will of the government? I'll leave it up to, I will call on people's intelligence to read it the way that they want to. And rather than just simply striking out the last sentence, I would replace it with the following sentence. Finally, that the Minister of International Development be invited to discuss this issue with the members of the committee. So, in this matter, the government side will be able to show that they're not closed-minded to debate. The minister will have a chance to come and meet with the members of the committee and to discuss this issue in an in-depth fashion. We understand this is controversial, but at the same time, we will not be wasting legislative time, which is a concern that we should all have. I would have liked to have come up with another solution. Perhaps we could have sat outside the hours of the House so that we could have had this debate. But let's come up with another solution, and that's what I'm proposing now, and that is that we invite the Minister of International Development to discuss this issue. And I had an opportunity to discuss this matter with the minister. I did not hide this from you. She seems to be prepared to come and meet with us. So I hope that this part of the motion or the sub-amendment will not lead to lengthy discussions preventing us from finally ruling on Mr. Harris's motion, which has been written which was so elegantly defended by Ms. McPherson. Thank you, colleagues. Thank you, Mr. Bergeron.
Amendment to Ms. Sahota's motion. I'm advised that the clerk will email the text around to just have that in front of you in writing, although Mr. Bergeron read it and it's not complex in its content. With your agreement, let's preserve the list of speakers as it was originally.
Mr. Chair, a point of order.
Sure.
On that, I think it would be helpful for me because I'm getting, I've got some documents here. I'm looking for the Mr. Harris's motion, and then Ms. Sahota's amendment, and then Mr. Bergeron's amendment, so I can see the three of them there, just to see what is gone, because I have a feeling that I really like Mr. Bergeron's sub-amendment, and I just want to back up to see what it does to Ms. Sahota's amendment, which I liked, and then what the ultimate effect is on the whole motion. And I know I've lost it a little bit because it's been about 2 months.
Monsieur le Président, est-ce que je peux me permettre de relire la...
May I reread the amended motion so that people will get the overall... Yes, that's very kind, Mr. Bergeron. That's not really necessary because the clerk has circulated the text.
Language is Madame Sahota's original language. The blue language is that of Monsieur Bergeron. If colleagues want to check their emails as Monsieur Bergeron is rereading the amendment, that may be the most expeditious way to proceed and to make sure that everybody has the language in front of them. Monsieur Bergeron, si c'est possible de répéter le texte.
So could you please reread the text? Yes, I'm going to reread the text as it appears once amended. So that the committee recognizes that due to a variety of factors, the government has faced delays in the supply of vaccines for Canadians through national manufacturing and international procurement. Canada is the only G7 country accessing vaccines through COVAX, an initiative intended to provide vaccines to high-risk individuals in low and middle-income countries. The committee further recognizes that this failure by the government to secure domestic supply makes Canadians more vulnerable to dangerous variants and extends the detrimental global economic impacts of COVID-19 by delaying vaccinations to high-risk people in poor countries. Finally, that the Minister of International Development be invited to discuss this issue with the members of the committee. Thank you, Mr. Bergeron.
We have the text in their emails. I would just like to seek the agreement of the committee to continue with the original speakers list, which now includes among the original four, Mr. Fonseca, then Mr. Oliphant, to transfer that speakers list over to discussion on the sub-amendment, followed by Dr. Fry, who has her hand raised as well on the sub-amendment. With that, Mr. Fonseca, please.
Sorry, Mr. Chair, point of order. It's not the usual practice to transfer a speaking list when you have a sub-amendment. I think we should deal with the sub-amendment.
Right. We've done it last time with the consent of the committee. If there's a disagreement on that, then we can open a new speakers list. Mr. Genuis, it's the committee's will, as colleagues wish.
I just would like to see us proceed to get this done. So if people don't need to speak to the sub-amendment because it reflects agreement, then let's just proceed. But I would request that people re-indicate their interest in being on the speaking list if they still have things to say in light of the new development.
I think we can leave it. Thank you, Mr. Genuis. It's a constructive comment. Let's leave it to the discussion of the two members that were still on the original speakers list, which is Mr. Fonseca and Mr. Oliphant. If they have comments on the sub-amendment, let's have them come in. And then Dr. Fry is the next speaker. And from the floor, I'm in the hands of the clerk to signal who would intervene in person. Mr. Fonseca, do you have comments on the sub-amendment?
Well, Mr. Chair, I just want to thank Monsieur Bergeron and also for his, as he says, finding compromise, finding this common ground, understanding that really our North Star here is to provide, the best information to our constituents and to be able to come forward. I guess with his 26 years of experience and Dr. Fry with her 28 years of experience, we have almost over half a century, and I think what we've heard here is that where there's a will, there's a way, And I think we're all speaking kind of, to the same thing. We want to be able to bring in the minister, bring in experts to be able to provide really clarity to what COVAX is all about. Who is it supporting? Who is it helping? What's Canada's role in COVAX? I'm proud of its role, but that's where I'll leave it, Mr. Chair. If I think members are thinking that we may bring it to a vote, I think we're finding some consensus here. So I'll leave it there, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fonseca. Mr. Oliphant, and then Dr. Fry.
My concern with not dealing with the speakers list not changing is I am in support of the sub-amendment. However, I have great difficulty still with one part of the motion as it stands. So if my fear is, and so if we use this method of me speaking to the sub-amendment, then I would also need to be speaking to the amended motion because it really follows up very much on Mr. Bergeron's comment that I do believe that we should find a nonpartisan way of doing it. But there is a degree of polemic in this motion that when it says that the committee recognizes the failure by the government to secure domestic supply makes Canadians more vulnerable, that doesn't have anything to do with the motion as it stands. And it's also an opinion that has not been verified by a committee study. We have not had, we're attempting to make a motion to report it to the House, not based on evidence that we've had before our committee, but on the opinion of a member. And I don't think that's the best way committees work. There's a place for that, and that is to bring a motion to the House. There's a place for that, and that's to call for a take note debate or an emergency debate. Those are bona fide parliamentary procedures that are there. This is not that. The committee does not do this kind of work normally like this. Maybe a subcommittee does, but we don't do this. And what this fails to do is also recognize the leadership that the Government of Canada has done with respect to the COVAX initiative around the world. If Canada hadn't been out early and demonstrating that this initiative is designed to encourage countries, wealthy and more developed countries, to make commitments to COVAX with the knowledge that they could use that for their own domestic supply, it was a very important device that Canada took leadership on. So when I read the motion as it stands, it doesn't have any of that nuance. It doesn't have any of that. So all of that is to say that's kind of giving you a little bit of a notice that I will be back to speak to this motion, and we'll want to deal with something in the middle of it. Meanwhile, I quite like Mr. Bergeron's sub-amendment and feel that I would support it, but want to get back then to Ms. Sahoda's amendment and then back to the original motion. So thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Oliphant. Dr. Fry, on the sub-amendment.
Thank you, Chair. On the sub-amendment, I think I am in agreement with what Rob is saying. I think that I have always felt that Mr. Bergeron wanted us to try and come to compromises on a lot of things we do. And I think that is what a committee like this is about. And so I'm in agreement that he's coming up with a compromise. However, I still feel that there are some pieces in this that are, as Rob said, presumptive on the part of the mover of the person who brought in the motion originally, that are verified by evidence. And for me, evidence is a very important thing. I like the idea that Mr. Bergeron is suggesting that we bring in the minister. I might actually want to add Minister Anand to that as well, so that we have the person who's procuring vaccines able to also give us some answers. So I think I like the intent of Mr. Bergeron's amendment. I like the idea that he's trying to find a way to do this. And as I said before, I won't go back into what is a filibuster or what isn't. I just was not filibustering. I was really concerned about disinformation. And there are a couple of pieces in this that still are not evidence-based statements. And I would like to see those couple of pieces taken out. And I may like to suggest, if Mr. Bergeron is interested, that we add Minister Anand to this list of ministers appearing to us. Clarity for me is what the name of the game should be about. And, that's about it.
Dr. Fry, thank you very much. It is on the floor as a sub-amendment and can't be amended further as a sub-amendment. But you, like Mr. Oliphant, you're free to bring points once we're back on Ms. Sahoda's amendment. Any other points, colleagues, on the sub-amendment as proposed by Monsieur Bergeron? Madam Clerk, colleagues on the floor in the committee room, anybody want to intervene on this? Okay. If there is no further debate, I would propose that we put Monsieur Bergeron's sub-amendment to a vote. Unless we have, by nodding of heads, if we have unanimous consent on the sub-amendment, we could proceed in that fashion. Is there anybody opposed? Is there any opposition to Monsieur Bergeron's sub-amendment? That will save us a bit of time and energy. Okay, I see no opposition. Madam Clerk, then the sub-amendment as proposed by Monsieur Bergeron carries. Thank you very much. And we are now procedurally back on the amendment as proposed by Ms. Sahota, and we are open for a new speakers list by virtue of raising hands virtually or by signaling to our clerk in the committee room.
Point d'ordre, Monsieur le Président.
On a point of order? Pardon me. Doesn't the sub-amendment deal with Ms. Sahoda's amendment?
Amendment once the sub-amendment has been disposed of, and unless we hear otherwise from the clerk's table?
Ben non, Monsieur le Président.
No, logically, Mr. Chair. We can't go back to Ms. Sahoda because she moved that we move the last sentence, which has since been replaced, and she moved that that we change the original motion, and I change it again.
The motion, the amendment by Ms. Sahota as amended by the sub-amendment that we're now discussing. So in effect, it is your language that is now on the table as accepted and open for this further discussion.
Point of order, just a point of clarification, really, I guess. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So basically, we are now looking at the motion as amended, the entire motion really as amended by the sub-amendment. That's what we're really on, right? So it's, I guess it's back to my motion in a way, but it's been further amended as amended by the sub-amendment. And so we're looking at the entirety, which looks like, which I would say then now reads with Mr. Bergeron's amendments, right?
I think we're all in agreement that that's procedurally, Madam Clerk. Maybe there's a better way to express that. I think it was just the way it was worded.
Yeah, sorry. I totally get what we're doing, but it was just worded weird. Thank you for the clarification. Okay,
so we will open a new speakers list. So far, I have Mr. Oliphant, Dr. Fry. Madam Clerk, again, I rely on you for comments from the committee room. Mr. Oliphant.
Thank you, and I think I'll just pick up from where I was, and I'm looking for some new language. I'm sorry, I'm going to be sort of looking to the side because I have it on my screen on my other computer. As I go through this, and as I said, I like Mr. Bergeron's rewriting of this, and we now have a new version that we're dealing with, which incorporates Ms. Sahoda's amendments that would then work. The direct drawing that says that the committee further recognizes that this failure by the government to secure domestic supply makes Canadians more vulnerable to dangerous variants and extends to detrimental global economic impacts of COVID-19 by delaying vaccinations to high-risk people in poor countries, to me is convoluted and is a difficult sentence. I'm sort of struggling with trying to get to unpack that. And I have no difficulty recognizing that Canada does not have domestic supply of vaccines. We have successive governments and successive businesses have determined that Canada is not a place that was ready to produce these vaccines. I think in hindsight now we think it should have been, and that some of the decisions by previous governments should not have been made, and some of the business decisions made by major pharmaceutical companies did not take Canada's importance into account. So I think we now know that. So we don't have domestic production, and we did a massive procurement effort to make sure that we did two things. We invested in development of vaccines, and we ensured contracts with 7 vaccines to make sure that we had enough vaccines for Canadians. There is a delay on that, obviously, and we are watching us play catch up. I'm not denying that. I'm not denying that some countries are ahead of us and some countries are behind us, and that we are needing to do that. But there is a causal link here that somehow, because we are taking a small number out of the millions of vaccines which are now being provided through the COVAX mechanism, that is causal and problematic for Canadians' well-being. I don't think we have evidence on. And do I think the world will be safe when the whole world is vaccinated? Yes. It will not be safe until then. And do I believe that we should have a robust domestic vaccination program? Yes. And it's a little bit like when you're on the airplane, frankly, that when they announce the system about the mask falling, we're a developing country. And I'm not shy about saying we put the mask on first to help the people beside us. I'm not shy about that. But I also say you don't just leave the mask on yourself. You continue to do that. So Canada has had leadership, really profound leadership, in encouraging European countries, other Western countries, to engage in the COVAX initiative. I don't think that's reflected in the motion. So by that, I'm seeing, when I read the motion, I see it as a partisan snipe. That's the way I see it. And what I'm trying to do is take the partisanship out of that and saying, what can we learn? What can we learn about COVAX as an initiative? Maybe we don't know everything about it. What can I learn about countries that have now acceded to COVAX that wouldn't have if Canada hadn't done that initiative? What is the problem? I mean, I read today about one country that is short on its COVAX supply. And, I immediately made notes about this because that's part of my job. And we'll be looking for ways to help that country. There are dozens and dozens of countries that need vaccines. What we want to do is to ensure we all get them. And we want to ensure Canadians get them. And we want to ensure that others get them. Witness to that is the fact that when the leader of the NDP was asked, the federal NDP was asked if he indeed would exercise the option that Canada had to access COVAX vaccines, he would not deny it. He would not deny it. And that is because I believe he's also doing his job as the leader of the New Democratic Party in Canada to ensure that Canadians have vaccines. And what we will do, similarly to what we're doing with the Americans, is that we will make sure that we get vaccines from the Americans on loan, and then we pay them back to try to equalize this distribution. The same could have been said for the AstraZeneca vaccines, which we got from India. The same could be said that we should not have taken them because they should go to another country. The same could be said for the Pfizer or the Moderna vaccines. Don't take them, give them to someone else. That's not the way we should lead in Canada. So we have a variety of things. We have the problem of domestic production, which we are working on, can do better. Opposition, please get your ideas in on how we encourage that investment in Canada. I think it's great if you do. We also have vaccines which we procured, the largest array of vaccines of any country in the world, which I'm very proud of, and they're coming in. I will admit that I did get my vaccine last week because I happened to fall in that sweet spot between 60 and 64. And the reason I did that was because this is a short shelf life on these AstraZeneca vaccines. I don't want to lose them. So the drugstores are calling to make sure that we use them. We use them because they're going to expire. And then we have the issue of COVAX, which I'd like to know more about. So I'm very pleased to invite the minister to come and talk about this, because I think that that will enlighten us about what COVAX was intended to do, how it's being perceived in the developing countries as well as in developed countries, how it is encouraging developed countries to actually engage in COVAX even further. I'm reading the numbers every day about countries that are now putting out billions of dollars is invested in COVAX. Bravo. That's what we should do. But other countries don't do that. Canada led the way on that. So what I would like to see in this motion is some recognition of the fact that we have provided leadership on COVAX and that it's working. I'm not denying that we are the first country to access them, but I'm also not embarrassed about it. Canadians want to be vaccinated. I get it. And then Canadians want others to be vaccinated as well. We also look at the death rates, both the morbidity rates as well as the mortality rates of COVID-19, and we recognize that the mortality rates are much higher in some countries than they are in other countries. And so it would be absolutely naive to say that every country does need or should get vaccines at the same rate without an understanding of both morbidity and mortality. So you look at those rates and you begin to see that Canada needs them. We have a higher death rate. We have an aging population. I look at the numbers, say, in Nigeria. Their average age is so much younger than Canada, and the mortality rate is thus much lower. We have an aging population. Therefore, we have a more vulnerable population than other countries. So I think that the nuance of all of that needs to be embedded in this motion. You know, I'm probably less concerned about it now that we passed the amendment, that we don't report it to the House, that we actually use this. But I actually think if we, and this is where I'd open the door to Mr. Harris and Ms. McPherson to say, if the minister has so disappointed in her explanation of what this is going on, we could make a report to the House. That we're not precluding that. That is the kind of thing we can do, but we should do it based on evidence. So all of that being said, I think, Mr. Chair, I would like to make an amendment. Now, I need to look at the clerk because, as Mr. Bergeron said, the sub-amendment has changed the amendment. Therefore, I do believe I would be amending the motion now as it stands in committee, as opposed to amending the amendment. And that, I think we can do that. Is that correct? I sort of see her nodding.
Madam Clerk, I believe that's going in the right direction. Is in fact correct.
Yes. So, Mr. Chair, as long as everybody understands, it was not clear to me. So, as long as everybody understands that you have agreed to the motion as amended by the sub-amendment already, then that's fine. You can move on to a new amendment.
Thank
you. As long as the text of that amendment doesn't touch the motion that Ms. Sahota introduced and that Monsieur Bergeron amended. And my understanding is that it will not. Okay, Mr. Oliphant.
So I would, and I don't have this in writing, and I apologize because it's Mr. Bergeron's amendment happily surprised me, but it still surprised me. So what I would like to do is the sentence that begins, the committee further recognizes that this failure, to amend that sentence to say, while the committee recognizes leadership by the Canadian government in the COVAX initiative, it also recognizes that the governments draw upon COVAX vaccines will, okay, sorry. You know something? Could I cede the floor, or do you want me to just keep talking while I write this out.
Onto something constructive. I don't know if there's opposition to you proceeding and developing your thoughts, because I think they may take us somewhere. I also want to take the opportunity just to remind colleagues that we have a scheduled hour for this. I'm not going to prejudge how long this discussion will take us or what the will of the committee is, but we do have a substantial number of items of committee business that we have also on the agenda for this afternoon. So I take Mr. Generous's point that we would think we would collectively want to move this forward, and I think are in the process of doing that. But Mr. Oliphant, if you want to take a moment just to elaborate to the point of potentially arriving at an amendment. If not, we can revert to the speakers list. But I don't believe
I have it now.
Okay,
I think I have it.
Go ahead, please.
So that sentence would read, while the committee recognizes the leadership of the Canadian government in the COVAX initiative, it also has concerns that the limited supply of vaccines in Canada makes Canadians more vulnerable to dangerous variants and extends the detrimental global impacts of COVID-19. So, because I'll repeat that, while the committee recognizes the leadership of the Canadian government in the COVAX initiative, it also has concerns that the limited supply, following up on Mr. Bergeron's not blaming, just saying it, and people can draw their own conclusions, the limited supply of vaccines in Canada makes, and then continues, Canadians more vulnerable to dangerous variants.
Thank you very much, Mr. Oliphant. And I now take Mr. Generous's point. This is an amendment to the original motion. And it's substantively different than the thought of the previous speaker. And we have a long speakers list that was developed prior to Mr. Oliphant taking the floor. I would like to solicit a speakers list on this amendment. We have a number of colleagues who have their hand up. If it's not to Mr. Oliphant's amendment, I would ask you if you could lower your hand and then just re-enter. If it is to Mr. Oliphant's amendment, I'm a bit challenged because I have some hands up here and I also have interventions from the floor. Just in terms of sequencing, but let's try to be constructive, colleagues, and stay in the vein of Mr. Oliphant's attempt to bring us to progress on this. If you've got thoughts on the amendment, please express them, and if you don't, please lower your hand. I have in the list right now Dr. Fry, Mr. Fonseca, Ms. Sachs. I see some hands being lowered, and also Monsieur Bergeron through the clerk, and Ms. McPherson. Yes, there's a point of order, Mr. Morant.
I'd like to have the amendment in writing before we continue the discussion. Okay. I think that's only fair. And also to Mr. Bergeron, I think he should have a translated version as well for amending these motions on the fly. It's difficult to have a debate about a motion where you're just hearing one member dictate what he thinks it should be verbally. So if we could get it in writing in English and French before we discuss it, that would be ideal.
It's thank you for the point, Mr. Morantz. Madam Clerk, is there a way to make that
Mr. Chair, that's a point of order. So on that point of order, my concern is that the standing orders are clear that amendments may be made verbally in a committee, not in writing, and may come in the language of the choice of the member. I'm not saying it wouldn't be helpful, but I'm concerned following the standing orders, which I really think that we do better when we stick to the standing orders, because in debate in committee, it is quite different than giving notice of motion and having motions presented, which need to come in both official languages. But I do want to retain the right of members to be able to make amendments to motions in one of the two official languages, French or English, and do our best to try to circulate them. But it would not nullify the motion. I think it would be very dangerous, because I do want to make sure that we follow those. And the clerk can confirm if I'm right or wrong or not.
Mr. Oliphant, I didn't see Mr. Morantz's point as an attempt to extinguish your amendment. The amendment is verbally before the committee and is in order. I simply saw it as a way to facilitate discussion among those colleagues who really might want to have the text in front of them if they hadn't had a chance to write it down as you said it. And if there's a way to generate that, I think that would be helpful in the spirit of, I think, the constructive vein that the committee has struck this afternoon. If not, then absolutely your amendment stands. And again, I'm now going to attempt to assemble a speakers list based on the hands that were already raised, but really the interest in discussing the point that you put forward. Dr. Fry, Mr. Fonseca, Ms. Sachs, Monsieur Bergeron, Ms. McPherson is who I have in the list as it currently stands. Dr. Fry.
Speaking to Mr. Oliphant's sub-amendment.
Correct. Amendment.
There are some pieces in the sub-amendment that concern me, because as we are speaking to clarity here, I do not agree that, well, I think if you want to talk about us recognizing the leadership of the government, et cetera, that becomes a little partisan. And so I can see people not wanting to read that. What I would like to speak to the fact is that we are attributing the ability of low and middle income countries to get vaccines and the ability of a national and international procurement, that is linked to COVID variants, and it isn't. We do know that some of the vaccines that are available now do not deal with some of the variants. Some of them do not deal with the South African variant, and some of them do not deal with the Brazil variant. So the current vaccines that we have now are not necessarily going to deal with the variants. So that's one thing that we can't say because it isn't based in evidence. And I just wanted to say that that is a misleading statement to say that it does. I agree, however, with the fact that that what Mr. Oliphant wants is clarity. I also agree with the fact that that what we want to do is to make sure that we ensure that there's factual data here. And as I said before, the only reason I didn't like Mr. Oliphant's amendment is that it continues to link us having supply of vaccinations, domestic and international, as being able to stop variants. And it isn't so in terms of evidence. And so I just wanted to make sure that we didn't put in something that is actually not based on evidence, because we know the Brazil variant and we know that the South African variant are still out there, and that we're not sure what vaccines are working against them accurately or not. I mean, this is moving so fast that nobody has a chance to see what's going on. And I know that countries are locking down because they're concerned about the rise in variants. But it doesn't mean that the current vaccines that are out there are going to deal with those variants. I want to make that clear. It does not mean that the current vaccines are out there are able to deal with some of the variants. They may be able to deal with a few, but not all. And so I don't want us to put language there that says that they will. I just wanted to make sure that that is clear. And for me, this whole issue is about clarity and about factual and about evidence-based information. And I know that that is Mr. Oliphant's bottom line as well, to make sure that we're clear. I would prefer that we have no what can I say, partisan language in this, because it just leads us down to arguing about, partisanship. I like the idea that when Mr. Bergeron spoke, he spoke to non-partisanship. What we really want to know is what's going on. How did we procure? How did we not procure? Are there any new vaccines out there that are dealing with variants? We want to get that information. So why don't we just bring in the Minister for International Development? And I would also, I want to say, again, for the sake of accuracy and factual data, let's bring in the Minister for Public Works and Procurement, because she's a procurer. She knows what's out there. She has been dealing with vaccine manufacturers. She knows what's going on. So let's kind of just bring those two. I don't want a variety of ministers coming in, 1 hour for one, 1 hour for another. And let's get some answers so that we can actually then have a very good discussion, something that goes out there to the public that is factual and evidence-based. That's my objective. So the only thing, as I said, I didn't like about Mr. Oliphant's was that it is continuing to link the idea that if we had more domestic supply and if we had more international supply, that we would be able to deal with the variants. And that is not really true.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fry. What I propose, colleagues, it's 4:35, and again, I don't want to be heavy on the clock. This is the collective will of the committee that's going to drive the agenda. But if we can get the round of interventions that's currently on the slate and see if we can take this amendment somewhere this afternoon, if it looks like we need more discussion time, I would suggest that we transition to committee business, because I do realize there are a number of motions that colleagues want to bring there and a couple of points of business that are important in terms of the way forward on the other studies that we're engaged in. So with that in mind, I want to just continue to go through the list as it's currently before me. It's Mr. Fonseca, Ms. Sachs, Monsieur Bergeron, Ms. McPherson, and Mr. Oliphant. Mr. Fonseca.
Well, thank you, Chair. And like I wanted to support Monsieur Bergeron, I will support his amendment, and also with Mr. Oliphant, and to hear from Dr. Fry and what she had to say in terms of clarity, in terms of public health, and what was very poignant was just how fast this is moving. Every day things change. It's evolving at such a quick pace that we've seen, at one point where, we were scrambling a little bit to get the vaccines. Now, by the end of this week, we'll have over 8 million vaccines will have come into Canada. By the end of June, we've got 36.5 million vaccines coming in to Canada. From COVAX, I believe it's 1.9 million vaccines that we said we would procure from COVAX. But on COVAX, and as Mr. Oliphant was saying, the leadership role, thinking back to the beginnings of COVAX, from the onset, we as Canada should be very proud that putting in $440 million by being the leader, being number one actually in COVAX. That leadership has brought others forward, and that's what we would like to hear from the minister, from experts, from those that understand COVAX and what it's able to do, and to show that through Canada's leadership that we've been able to get billions of dollars of investments now within COVAX. More and more countries every day are coming online, and really speaking about the same message that our Prime Minister has said. We need the whole world vaccinated. To protect us, we need everybody protected. That's the only way that it will work. And to know that we've been able to procure the most vaccines on a per capita of anywhere else in the world allows us, as I said, I spoke to those numbers, how many vaccines we'd have here by June. We will have many. Now we will be able to share those vaccines with COVAX, with others, to be able to ensure that what we all are looking for is to get everybody, as many people as possible, vaccinated throughout the world as quickly as possible. So I think Canada has taken the right approach. And when it comes to the manufacturing of vaccines, we can't go back to 1980s, where under the Mulroney times or whoever was in government at that time that decided that we no longer needed to manufacture vaccines. But what we did do, as soon as the pandemic was announced by the WHO, within 12 days, Canada was right there. We invested $200+ million. Within 30 days, another $600 million. That's showing the leadership, I think, that Mr. Oliphant wants to see within this motion that we need to speak to. And now over $1 billion. And I know that Monsieur Bergeron and all Quebecers and all Canadians will be very happy that the manufacturing of vaccines will be, I believe, in the Montreal area, and we're all proud of the great knowledge that we have here, the ability, the human resources to be able to do that in very short order. I'm watching the news. I'm not sure if all this is correct, Mr. Chair, but seeing that, we're going to be able to start manufacturing our vaccines. I think it was the CEO or the COO of the plant saying by the fall we will actually be able to manufacture here. We've learned a lot. And through this pandemic, and we continue to learn. And what this is getting to is the speed of this. I think that what we see in this motion, first, I don't agree with much of it, the premise of the motion, but what I say is it's already past due. It's past its due date. It is no longer whatever was trying to be done here with this motion. But I think it could be amended. We could do something to get us to where we want to be. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Fonseca, thank you very much. We'll go straight to Ms. Sachs.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all the colleagues who are contributing to. I feel like we're making progress with Mr. Bergeron's sub-amendment that we've taken on, and I'd like to answer to what my colleague Mr. Oliphant mentioned. And with regards to this one statement in the current amendment that we're looking at, is the committee further recognizes that the failure by the government to secure domestic supply makes Canadians more vulnerable to dangerous variants and extends the detrimental global impacts of COVID-19 by delaying vaccinations to high-risk people in poor countries. So as my colleague Dr. Fry mentioned, we always have to be so careful in what we put forward in our discussions of what we're doing in the public realm, because there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty, there's a tremendous amount of anxiety with Canadians right now about variants, about supply, which vaccine is safe to take, which isn't, and on it goes. And if in this committee, we have the responsibility that any statement that we put forward is based on evidence and is based on clarity of the facts. That is what we're here to present to do. So as Mr. Fonseca said, the proposal was to pull a draw of 1.9 million from the COVAX stock that we contributed to, amongst with 92 countries who are participants in the Gavi COVAX makeup, of which we were a leader in investing to make sure not just for domestic supply, which the agreement does allow for domestic draw, but on an international scale to make sure that there was a collective effort of which we were leaders in setting up this structure, and we were leaders in investing in the structure. That aside, if we want to perhaps say that is a little bit partisan, let's go to the facts of as of March 22nd. What has COVAX achieved? It's shipped over 31 million vaccines to 57 participant countries, 31 million. And this motion is debating about 1.9 million, of which we always said we had the ability to draw from, versus the 8 million that are arriving in Canada by the end of March, and the slated 100 million available to Canadians by the end of September. So let's just deal with the facts, which are the numbers. And numbers don't lie. We know what we are participating in. We know what we've invested. My colleague, Mr. Fonseca, really mapped out the amounts of investment that we've put in and the leadership role that we've played. And so this statement to say that that our draw of 1.9 million is delaying vaccines to high-risk people in poor countries, well, 31 million have already gone out to 57 participating countries. So that statement to me really is misleading. It doesn't show the truth of where this program is going and what it is providing globally, and what we are leading participants in, and really is puts anxiety in the minds of Canadians of what this program is, why we participated in it, and what we are contributing to a global effort to address, to make sure every citizen gets a vaccination who needs one, that every person around the world who wants a vaccine can be protected, because we all need to be protected. We all need, as countries, as individuals, as states, we all have a role to play in this, and Canada has played a leading role. So I just, my colleague, Mr. Oliphant, has raised his concerns and offered a solution to address this line, and I really feel that we need to look at the numbers that are on the table. They're up on the Gavi website. You can see the numbers of distribution right there. It's constantly moving, it's constantly changing. The numbers are higher every day in terms of provision of vaccines to participating countries. And the facts are there, 31 million by March 22nd. I think that is a tremendous accomplishment by COVAX and Gavi, and we can be proud of that. So I really think we need to take some time to consider what the purpose of what we're putting in this statement is, this one line about the committee recognizing the failure and that global economic impacts, because it's wholeheartedly isn't in alignment with the data that's available. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Sachs, thank you very much. Madam Clerk, through you, je passe la parole à Monsieur Bergeron.
Mr. Bergeron, the floor is yours. Mr. Chair, I won't hide the fact that I'm not too happy with what's happening right now. In all sincerity, given the amendments moved by Ms. Sahota, I thought that the two sentences that were offensive to the government side were the ones that I amended to make this motion more acceptable. is it the ideal motion that the government side was dreaming about? I'm aware that the answer is no. However, since Ms. Sahota didn't even allude to amending anything else in the motion, couldn't we all agree and in a spirit of cooperation to leave it like this so that we don't just go on and on with this discussion? I must confess, I had written down the new amendment. I wrote that down, but Mr. Oliphant came up with his version, which doesn't please Mrs. Fry. So we may just have this interliberal debate on whether or not to go ahead with Mr. Oliphant's motion. I think that everything is being orchestrated so that there's no way out of this, and so that we're not able to reach an agreement or some type of compromise. And once again, I'm doubtful about what's happening. I would say I'm go so far as to say I'm disappointed. I could tell you what I've penned with respect to Ms. Fry. I am not a scientist as she is, but when it comes to information, I feel that I am someone who is relatively well-informed, and I do take it upon me to read what's available on the issue. But I was led to believe that the vaccination is probably a good way to avoid the spread of the variants as well. And if we don't get vaccinated, the variants will spread in the population with very damaging effect. So I wouldn't change that part of the motion, but I would replace the sentence that reads as follows: this failure of the government to secure domestic supply makes Canadians more vulnerable to dangerous variants and extends the detrimental impacts to high-risk people. So I hope we'll be able to come up with a solution, but I'm getting more and more convinced now that the government side doesn't want to find a solution. They're finding ways to come up with such convoluted sentences that will not be able to get a solution. So in all honesty, I don't know what to do anymore. I'm saying to myself that we're just losing time and we're not being useful here, and I'm disappointed. Thank you very much, Mr. Bergeron.
Procedurally, Madam Clerk, a sub-amendment to Mr. Oliphant's amendment of the main motion, the way I've understood it. And what I'd like to ask colleagues, just in light of the clock, I think there is interest. I'm sensing interest on the part of members to move the conversation forward and to be constructive. I'm also sensing some frustration. There is some committee business before us, as I've mentioned before. Is there a willingness on the part of the committee to continue this discussion for another 10 minutes to see where it goes, or should we break off now and schedule to revisit? I just wanted to get a sense from members in terms of where we are with respect to this afternoon's timeline and the thoughts that are before us now, and what could be potential solutions to the discussion. We could run this right to the end of the clock and we will lose any opportunity to, I think, address some important business that will keep us moving forward, including issues with respect to the agenda for this week. But there may be thoughts to the contrary. Just wanted to survey quickly the outside of the speakers list that I currently have, the view of the committee in terms of what we should do this afternoon.
A point of order, Mr. Chair.
Dr. Fry.
Please. I am quite distressed. I like Mr. Bergeron's idea of finding a motion that we can all buy. But I also am a little concerned that my intentions and my statements are being misconstrued as part of some liberal plot. I really want people to understand. Every single day, I read JAMA, I read the British Medical Journal, I read all of the things that come out on this. The idea that you're linking the fact that we do not have domestic vaccines to people being able to get variants,
right.
To be able to be cured by the vaccine for variants is absolutely untrue, and that bothers me. That I'm going to have to go to
Dr. Fry, I think that's more of a point of debate rather than a point of order.
It's not a point of debate. It's one that I feel that my own statement is being presumed to be malicious, and it isn't.
I don't
like that personal.
I don't know if the word malicious was used, Dr. Fry. I think this is something that we can.
Not malicious, but actually. You know,
what I'm trying to get to in a few short minutes is the committee's sense of where we should take this discussion with respect to the remaining time this afternoon.
Well, let's get it on to what you need to do in terms of committee business.
I'm happy to let the committee continue it. In fact, I wouldn't stand in the way if that's what the committee feels could and should be done. I see interest in the substance. I also see some procedural concerns and some concerns with respect to how various positions are being characterized. But Ms. McPherson, do you have a thought on where we should go this afternoon with respect to the remaining timeline of the committee?
Mr. Chair, I think that it is only reasonable that we stop, because obviously the Liberals have no interest in actually acting with any sort of good faith on this. Mr. Bergeron has brought forward exactly what was asked for. He brought forward amendments that met exactly what Ms. Sahota had asked for, and we are continuing to filibuster. You know, we speak about people having a lot of expertise in this committee, and I can tell you one thing: I am new. I am a new parliamentarian, and I find this absolutely disgusting to listen to this nonstop when there is so much work to do, so much things that this committee should be looking at. I'm also very, very upset that it is being called the partisan snipe. This would have been something I would have put forward no matter what. I think it is, in fact, one of the most pressing issues of our time, and I don't say that lightly. So I would recommend that we stop discussion on this now, because I don't see any way forward that will be fruitful.
Ms. McPherson, thank you, and I'd like to hear Mr. Oliphant is the third member on the speakers list on this point, and then if it's the will of the committee to transition into committee business, I would suggest we do that. But Mr. Oliphant, please, your thoughts.
I am fine to go to committee business as well.
Let's do that. I don't want to prejudice any or preempt any substantive interest in the motion as it stands. There is room for the committee to take it back up and to be constructive. There's also room to talk offline and on the sidelines, and hopefully there'll be.
Can I, just before we go into committee business, just quickly clarify some things, since we are back on my amendment. I haven't spoken for many meetings now, I feel. I just wanted to clarify based on some of the points that were made today. All I wanted to say is when I had moved my original amendment, I had done it off the floor on the spot without consulting with my colleagues. I had a conversation with Ms. McPherson about removing that, but in terms of the language, as you know, I didn't come prepared with something to email everybody right away. I just kind of changed stuff off the floor. So I had not, I was trying to do minimal changes so that we could come to some kind of agreement. And I had not consulted with all my colleagues on language exactly. I was just trying to put something forward that I thought was going to be constructive at that time. But anyways, it was unfortunate that at that point we didn't get an agreement. That's all I wanted to say.
Thank you, Mr. Hoda. If colleagues agree, then let's pull the parking brake on this, but preserve the interest in continuing the discussion further offline or in the committee setting, because there's some interest still on the part of at least some members. But let's disconnect. Let's go back to the link for the in-camera portion of the meeting this afternoon and reconnect in about 5 minutes in camera. Thank you, colleagues.
Thank you.